some selected highlights from the latest CLOE survey, the CLOE 3 survey. As Barbara said, I am Chief Research Officer at Eduventures Research, which is part of NRCCUA, now also ACT, and I'll let Ron introduce himself. Although I see Ron is looking for the audio.
You're
button.
on mute.
Yeah.
There we go.
All right, here I am. This is Ron. Happy to be here with you this afternoon. And we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'll turn it back to Richard to get us started.
Thanks, Ron. And you'll see Eric Fredrickson also named there. Sorry, just go back to the previous slide. Eric is a Chief Online Officer, Chief Online Learning Officer. That's not his official title. He's Associate VP for Online Learning at University of Rochester. We partner with Eric because he's done a lot of interesting work chronicling the Chief Online Officer as individuals, their career trajectories, their responsibilities. And we saw a lot of complementary elements between his work and our work, and we're delighted that he is now a contributing editor to CLOE going forward. And I'd also like to acknowledge our CLOE 3 sponsors. Appreciate their support for the project, iDesign, and also Extension Engine and Instructional Connections. We appreciate their support. So next slide. As I said, this is CLOE 3. The third time we've done this survey. We began in 2016, and we've had a great increase in the number of Chief Online Officers and institutions that have contributed to the survey. You can see it's gone from 104 back in 16 to 280 in 2018, and a diverse array of institutions here broken out between two-year institutions and then four-year public and private. We've yet to get a decent response rate from for-profit institutions. We have a small number, but not sufficient to represent that sector, but we're hoping that changes going forward. Next slide. So as most of you know, CLOE stands for the changing landscape of online education, and we see this as a response to the mainstreaming of online. Years ago, we struggled to even know how many online students there were. Nowadays, that data is tracked by the federal government, but there's a lot of gaps in information and understanding about how institutions are organizing online, their strategies, their tactics, their approach to management and operation. And we see CLOE as trying to address that gap and help understand the mechanics of mainstreaming, but also the significance of mainstreaming. And the CLOE survey therefore covers the kind of issues you see there on the left-hand side of the chart. And today we're not going to try and cover everything. We're going to focus on particular themes, some highlights we think are interesting, and know that we will be delving into the CLOE 3 findings in much more detail in the CLOE 3 report, which will come out in the first quarter of 2019. So this webinar today, we're going to focus on 4 different things. We're going to take a look at online course activities and interactions. What's going on in online courses within institutions? Is everything the same? Is it different? What's going on? What do we mean by this word online? Then we're going to look at how online learning is governed within an institution, who's involved, what are the mechanisms for decision making. We're then going to look at the question of online student success. How is it being tracked? And in general, how do Chief Online Officers view online student success, view to the success of more traditional students and modalities. And then we'll talk about some quality assurance principles and practices when it comes to online. Next slide. So,
all right, then. I think I can take over from here.
Okay.
As a preamble to our 4 themes today, I wanted to bring you up to date on our use of models or development of models. As we've collected more data over the 3 years, we have begun to see the emergence of different models of online learning based on institutional characteristics. We're finding clusters of interrelated characteristics that differentiate institutional and online program types. here's a list of some of the models that we are concentrating on and their defining criteria. Reading from the top down, the enterprise level programs, these are online programs with more than 7,500 full-time and part-time students. There are about 150 institutions nationwide with those characteristics. And we think that they have embraced online learning to the extent that it is a driving force in their institutions, and they need to be looked at separately. We're also looking at regional public universities, schools that draw their enrollment primarily from a region within their home state, and mid-sized private nonprofit universities, and again, looking at them regionally. We're looking at community colleges that have less than 7,500 fully and partly online students. The small number of community colleges that have more students than this are in our enterprise level category. And we're also beginning to look at low online enrollment institutions, fewer than 1,000 online students. And you can see the numbers of these different types of institutions in our sample. More models may emerge from the data as we go forward. We have our colleague Eric Fredrickson, for example, looking at Carnegie classifications to see if they hold together in terms of common characteristics, from baccalaureate to master's level to doctoral and research institutions. We can give you a general overview here of what we're learning about these different groups. Here is a list of some areas where they seem to differentiate between the models. In the breadth of their online program, the number of degrees and certificates they offer, their enrollment trends, their experience in recent years with growth or stabilization, their views of competition from other types of institutions, and they differentiate there as well. They show a differential capacity to embrace change. They differ on whether they emphasize fully online programs and courses versus blended courses. And there is a differentiation between their emphasis on courses that are independent of each other and on programs. So those are areas where we're finding that each model has different characteristics. But we're also finding other areas where attitudes, policies, and practices cut across all of the models, at least so far. The strong preference for fully online at the course and program level over blended or hybrid programs and courses. Their consistency in terms of the pedagogy that makes up their courses, and the rarity with which face-to-face sessions are made available. Centralization as an organizing principle, management characteristics and budgeting. These are areas where we have found more commonality than differentiation. Just as one brief illustration of the way in which these things play out, the emphasis on independent online courses versus a focus on building fully online programs. Here, course emphasis is indicated in green, showing a dominant role in community colleges, versus little interest in enterprise level programs and a marginally greater presence in regional public institutions. In contrast, the focus on full online programs in blue is almost an opposite pattern, with the enterprise level institutions, the largest enrollment institutions, heavily emphasizing program development. And if you look at the community college bars, only a little over 10% of their emphasis is on full programs. It may be understandable in terms of the focus on the first 2 years, the associate level at the community college level, the fact that many of their students do not stay through even that degree and tend to come for very specific targeted courses. But there's much more that could be speculated on to explain these differences. Back to you, Richard.
So now we're going to take our first highlights theme, online course activities and interactions, trying to figure out what's going on under this word online that's thrown around casually as if we all know exactly what it means and what's going on from a student experience. Next slide, thank you. So for the first time in the Chloe 3 survey, we introduced some questions to try and dig into this a little bit more. And we asked chief online officers to give us their view as to the average nature of the student interaction within their online courses. And we broke out 4 different types of interaction: student interaction with materials in the course, student interaction with other students, student interaction with faculty, and student interaction with other kinds of staff, support staff, mentors, coaches, that kind of thing. And you can see at the bottom of this chart, the Chloe sample breakdown. So the average distribution of these kinds of activity in terms of student time within a typical online course. Chief online officers said overall that about half the interaction was students with materials, 22% was peer interaction with other students, 23% was interaction with faculty, and only 3% was interaction with other kinds of staff. And we thought, fair enough, that sounds like a pretty typical traditional online course, online, asynchronous, discussion-led, and so on. But what was surprising was that when we looked at this distribution by institutional type, some of the categories Ron called out, the enterprise level, the largest, the regional publics, the community colleges, we saw almost exactly the same distribution. And at least to me, that was a little bit surprising. I thought perhaps the larger institutions might put more emphasis on self-paced learning, say, to accommodate scale, and perhaps smaller institutions might spend more time on student interaction with faculty or whatever. But on average, we see almost the same level of interaction regardless of size, regardless of sector, regardless of institutional type. Now, that's not to say there aren't counterexamples. The box at the bottom of this chart shows some extremes. So there were some Chloe 3 respondents that said the entire student online experience is interaction with materials. It's entirely self-paced, perhaps a form of radical CBE, for example, very personalized. There are others that emphasize peer learning. There was a Chloe 3 respondent that said 80% of student time in their online courses typically is spent interacting with peers. There was an institution that said 70% of the typical online student time is spent interacting with faculty, and then there was an institution that said 30% of their online course time for students is spent interacting with other kinds of staff beyond faculty. So there are differences at a more micro level, but when you aggregate it up by some of these categories in terms of scale or public versus private or 2-year versus 4-year, we don't see that difference. And I think the implications of this are either that online has arrived at a certain plateau in terms of operational familiarity, certain tools and techniques, and it's emblematic of a certain maturity in the sector. Or you could interpret it to say, this is just an average, and behind the scenes, institution by institution, there's a lot of difference that isn't captured here. Perhaps we need to dig into that. Or you might interpret it to say, online is becoming, a little too stale, and we're not seeing breakthroughs or differentiation between different models, perhaps leveraging different pedagogies, different technologies that might allow an institution to stand out in an otherwise ever more crowded, commoditized marketplace. So there's many questions this slide and this data poses, and we can certainly dig into more of that in the CLOE 3 report. But I think it is pushing into interesting territory, trying to go beyond just using this word online as if we all know exactly what it means and what should it mean. What's the best student experience in an online setting? And does this kind of breakdown match that? Or should we start to move some of these levers and see whether that leads to superior outcomes? Next slide. We also asked chief online officers to tell us the extent to which, again, from a typical online course point of view at their institution, the kind of activities going on, the kind of technologies and pedagogies employed. And this chart shows two different kinds of responses. The red bar was the proportion of chief online officers that said that this particular technique or tool was either required or more likely very common at their institutions' online courses. And then the blue bar is the addition that said, yes, it's not required and it's not very common, but it is common. So the blue bar is an aggregate of those three. So you can see if you start at the bottom, certain tools and techniques are, if we include at least common, are almost universal. So things like the classic threaded discussion, use of preparatory readings, short written assignments, short quizzes, longer assignments, pre-recorded video, group projects, and so on, commonplace, almost universal. And this is a mix of standard pedagogical techniques that wouldn't be amiss in the traditional classroom on campus, as well as things like threaded discussions that are particular to online learning and in a sense are trying to replicate the best of the traditional seminar model, if you like. But you can see once you get to about a third up from the bottom, the required or very common starts to shrink down to below 50%. So once we get to pre-recorded video created in-house, that shrinks right back down. It's common at 88%, but very common or required, less than half that. And you see that pattern across use of group projects, student presentations, use of third-party video, that same kind of a gap. And then the remainder, everything shrinks back down to barely a majority or less. Live video, only 53% of chief online officers said that was common at their institution. So there's a big difference. Some using live video, but many institutions it's not present or it's rare. Use of live audio between faculty and students, similar kinds of characteristics. And then often talked about, but we can see here rarely used or at least rarely required or commonly used, things like digital simulations, role play, whether digital or otherwise, and then various kinds of digital or non-digital games. So building on the last slide, this question of, well, what does an online course mean? Is today's online course much the same as that 5 years ago, even 10 or 15 years ago? We hear a lot of energy around new tools and techniques, but are they really maturing and mainstream into the classroom? Are institutions adopting them wholesale and defining them as part of their brand, their approach to online, or are they just leaving it to faculty preference or even student preference? So I think you get a good feel from this slide. What's the norm? What's perhaps middle ground? And then what's still very much the exception? And should institutions that are ambitious in this territory be looking to the top part of this chart for where they might find scope for differentiation and perhaps to shake up the online norm and perhaps improve online outcomes? Or equally, is the typical decentralized culture in a 4-year and to some extent a 2-year institution not amenable to that kind of pedagogical standardization, if you like, rather than it's more of a faculty-led matter? Next slide. And here we break down those tools and techniques by some of the big institutional categories that Ron talked about earlier on. And you do start to see some differences here compared to that first slide I showed you where there didn't seem to be much difference in terms of the kind of interaction students were reported to be having. So you can see, for example, the enterprise level institutions for some of these less commonly used tools and techniques that you see broken out along the bottom. The enterprise level institutions are most likely to report at least common use of those tools across the spread of those tools and techniques. But still, we're still talking barely 50%, and in some cases less than that. For the other institutions, you're seeing live video and live audio most commonly adopted at some scale, and then the rest, we're talking perhaps a third or a quarter or even less. So some favoring of innovation, if that's the right word, for the enterprise level institutions, perhaps reflecting bigger capital or willingness to scale or a more centralized approach to online learning generally. Less so across others, but not dramatic gaps for a number of these techniques. So will we start to see the enterprise level institutions leave the norm, break ahead of the pack, and start to describe themselves to the market in terms of their mainstream use of these kinds of novel tools? And will that start to make a difference to student interest in those institutions and in terms of their track record on student success? So interesting questions to contemplate going forward, and we'll dig into this more in the Chloe 3 report. So Ron, over to you, I think.
Yes, and I'll be talking about what we're learning about online governance structures and the emerging trends there. This first slide is really an update of a slide that we've used or developed in Chloe 2. But with the much larger sample that we had available to us. And the main point here is that each of our model types is showing a strong movement in the direction of centralizing support services for online learning. And only the lighter blue on the right side shows the preference for distributed responsibility among academic units working with the support side of the institution. So I don't want to dwell on this, but just to make that point that centralization seems to be confirmed as the general direction. The trend is emphasized by this new data that we developed for Chloe 3. Another indicator of rising centralization is the trend toward creation of chief online officer positions. Almost all responding institutions have someone serving in this role, but the growth of chief online officer positions in the past decade is perhaps even more significant. A third of reporting institutions created such a position in the past decade, and you can see the trend toward further growth in the most recent years. Most of what we know about the functions of chief online officers has been developed in collaboration with Eric Fredrickson. And in 2018, we merged our prior work with Eric's to create a more comprehensive list of chief online officer responsibilities. And we tested how common they were among our approximately 280 responding chief online officers. We found that more than 9 out of 10 respondents listed all these functions. In parentheses, we're listing here where they had the lead responsibility for that issue. Otherwise, they're simply contributing to it. but I think you'll recognize in this list some of the critical issues for the success of online learning at the institutional level. Here's an additional list of functions that 3 out of 4 chief online officers seem to perform. It's too long to read here. I'll leave it up on the screen for a moment for you to scan it yourselves, but it does indicate the breadth of the role and point toward its increasing scope over time. And clearly this becomes a focal point for institutional direction in terms of online learning. But the COO does not operate in isolation. Many relate to standing institutional committees and entities through their report lines to the chief online officer or president. But more than half in all sectors work with standing online committees and councils. This is a question we added to our survey this year with surprisingly strong results. Community colleges show the greatest prevalence of such structures, perhaps because they ventured into online learning earlier on average than four-year institutions. The other standouts are the enterprise level institutions whose size, focus, and goals demand a greater level of coordination. But you can see even in low online enrollment institutions and mid-sized institutions, more than half have dedicated committees or councils that address online issues. However, as the next slide shows, in most cases, their role is advisory rather than determinative. They're still struggling for a clear role in the governance structure of a majority of institutions that confirm their existence. They tend to work with the chief online officer in an advisory capacity on a narrow range of issues, setting online policies, strategic planning for online, coordination across programs and schools, and technology acquisition. But those low percentages next to those items indicates that they are, in most cases, not the determinative body to address those issues, but make recommendations that have to be acted on an institutional governance structure. So what we have in totality is the evolution of governance instruments addressing specifically online learning, and interestingly, cutting across all of our models and sectors, including those with relatively low online enrollments. But I think we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years just where all this is headed and how much authority and independence can be exercised by the bodies dedicated to online enrollment rather than balancing that with all other institutional demands. It's a moving target. Richard, back to you.
Thank you, Ron. And I should have mentioned earlier that please do pose your questions in the chat as we go through. If items occur to you or something's not clear or you want to share an institutional experience, I see some people doing that, but do please offer your input and perspectives, and I expect we'll have some time at the end to respond to some of those. So our third theme for this webinar is the question of online student success and how institutions are going about measuring online student success. Should we just resort to conventional metrics like retention and persistence rates or graduation? Should we be using things like student satisfaction and engagement, things like the NESI survey? Should we go post-graduation if we think that many online students are older, they're adult learners, they have a career advancement goal in mind when they opt to pursue an online degree in particular, and therefore should we judge online student success primarily in terms of post-graduation outcomes, employment levels, promotions, wages, and should we track that 6 months after graduation like we might do for a traditional age undergraduate student, or should it be years later to really understand that question of impact and question of success? So a complicated territory. So let's look at some of the data. Next slide, please. So we asked chief online officers to give their perspective on this classic question around online learning, something that's been asked over the years in one form or another. Is online as good as on ground? On ground as the benchmark, at least the norm. And here you can see those results. So again, we're asking chief online officers to comment on their perception of online overall at their institution, recognizing that at some institutions online may be very fragmented and decentralized, and it may be hard to come to a view as to its superiority or normalcy or inferiority versus on ground. But nonetheless, these were the overall responses. So you see some differences. So the blue bar is where the chief online officer thinks at their institution, in relative terms, online students perform better than on campus or on ground students. The yellow bar is those where they feel the performance is about the same regardless of delivery mode. And the red is where they feel that online students in general perform worse than on ground. And you can see, starting from the left-hand side, community college respondents, only 3% feel that their online students perform better than their campus students. About 40% think it's around the same, but a majority, small majority, 55% think that in general, their online students perform worse than their on-ground students. And that's consistent with the literature in this field. There's been quite a lot of work over the years focused on the community college sector because its investment in online has been so long-standing and so scaled in many respects. Online is perhaps most mainstream, certainly at the course level among community colleges. And yet community colleges, by definition, tend to be open enrollment, enroll students who are often either not able to enter four-year schools if that's their desire, or are returning after a period of time and start at the community college level. And therefore there may be a tension between the demands of an unfamiliar delivery mode or perhaps a delivery mode that requires more self-motivation if it's somewhat less socialized than attending a traditional campus. Some might argue that online learning is less of a good fit, at least a wholly online program is less of a good fit for a typical community college student than perhaps more academically prepared four-year student. So are these results, these opinions from chief online officers based on often years of experience and some scaled online activity consistent with that? Is there something about fully online that tends to be, yes, convenient and flexible for busy students who are often working? You know, it's a great fit in that sense, but in terms of student retention and persistence and coming out the other end of a program, is online more problematic? And again, these are averages. I'm sure behind the scenes there may be forms of online that offset some of these disadvantages when it comes to student characteristics or the nature of typical online that might change the calculus here. But it's interesting that the community college sector reports a rather different and somewhat more negative view when it comes to online student outcomes. We see quite a different point of view from the regional four-year public institutions. 13% think online is actually better than on ground in terms of student performance at their institution, which is interesting. But the dominant view, 81%, is that there's no difference. The classic no significant difference phenomenon that has characterized research into distance learning over decades, that delivery mode on this view is really not the point. And if other things are equal in terms of pedagogy or student characteristics or faculty commitment and input and contribution, then the outcomes tend to be much the same. So that's what the norm, the consensus seems to be from regional four-year publics. And then only 6%, the smallest response, is that online emerges as worse. The next category, mid-size four-year private, you might imagine would look much like regional four-year public, but they don't. We see a much more even split in responses here. And this may reflect the diversity behind this label. Mid-size four-year private covers R1 institutions through liberal arts colleges, religious institutions, and all manner of diversity. So it's hard to generalize here in particular. And that may explain why we see some pretty diverse results. So a quarter of respondents say that they think online students actually perform better than on ground, which is the largest ratio across the four categories seen here. And an interesting one, we rarely, I think, see convincing data that calls out online as somehow better than rather than as good as, or in some cases worse than. So we need to dig behind that ratio and try and understand how to explain it. Is it consistent with a different approach to online learning, perhaps greater use of synchronous models, or perhaps an element of blended learning, some aspect of face-to-face, or smaller classes, or fewer programs? Is that consistent with online emerging as better? Or are those just assumptions and not borne out by reality? And then on the other side, 31% saying online is worse. Does that reflect just knee-jerk assumptions about campus is best and online can never match up to it? Or is it certain kinds of students who tend to opt for online, who perhaps are less well prepared, less traditional, and it's those characteristics that tend to lead to the worst outcomes, not so much online learning itself? But on the other hand, if online tends to attract those students, then I don't think we can be content with the scenario where online is great for access but tends to be worse for outcomes. That's really not fulfilling the promise of online, and it's clearly not the outcome that students are anticipating when they choose to enroll. So again, if lots of institutions are finding online proves worse, what can be done to offset that? Can different tools, different techniques, perhaps even different admission criteria or student support services be put in place to try and offset that and lower that red bar and increase the size of at least the yellow bar and perhaps even the blue bar? And then the enterprise level institutions look much more like the regional four-year publics. And this is perhaps surprising, or perhaps not what these institutions would like to be able to say. These are, by definition, the biggest players, the most committed to online, and have the most capital at their disposal, perhaps in some cases. And you might imagine that they would be most bold and keen to emphasize the power of online learning. And perhaps 11% saying online is better than is disappointing. Why are we not seeing a higher ratio there, given their scale, their experience with online, perhaps, as we saw earlier on, their commitment to less standard tools and techniques when it comes to online classes? Should we expect that this sector in particular would produce better outcomes if anyone was going to? And is that 11% a bit of a letdown? Or should we say, well, actually, no, we should be looking at the yellow bar. The yellow bar is about parity. Delivery mode is to some extent not the point. It's about good teaching and learning regardless of the modality. And we really should be looking for the yellow bar to be the high one. And 74% for these big players accommodating lots of students, often very non-traditional students, often at rather low price points. That 74% is testament to the success of those models at scale. And we should champion that as the success we're looking for. And then 16% say that online outcomes in general are worse than on ground. And I should have said this question was only answered by institutions that had mixed mode. So it didn't make sense if you were a wholly online institution, say. But for the vast majority of CLOE 3 respondents, they were mixed mode institutions. So a very interesting array of responses here. And again, is the yellow bar what we should be focusing on and minimizing the red bar? Or should we really be more ambitious and look for the blue bar to grow over time online as better than on ground? You know, is on ground our benchmark? Or, as I heard at an event I was at yesterday, surely we can do better than on ground. You know, is that the right benchmark, or should we be aiming higher than that? So next slide. So another perspective on the online student success question is, do chief online officers actually have the right data to answer that question? As I said at the outset to this section, what do we mean by online student success? How do we judge this question? And the prior slide took that question for granted. We just said, well, in general, however you might measure it, do you judge online student performance to be better, the same, worse than campus student performance? But we also dug into the kinds of data that chief online officers have at their disposal when trying to measure the performance of online students and make this comparison between fully online and campus students. And here we call out a number of metrics. So we asked, which measures of performance do you compare between fully online and ground students? What data do you have that is available regardless of delivery mode, rather than, well, we have it for campus students, but we don't have it for online, or vice versa? So 80% of chief online officers said we actively compare the grades in comparable courses between fully online and ground students. And 68% said we compare term-to-term retention rates. Only 42% actively compare graduation rates. Now, this may be lower because at many institutions, online programming is still relatively new, and there may still be few cohorts that have gone all the way through an online program, particularly at bachelor's level, and therefore the sample size may be pretty small on the online side, and therefore chief online officers may be leery of making those comparisons at this stage. But at many institutions, that's really not the situation. So I would expect that ratio to grow. And in the CLOE report, we can start to break down these responses between, say, the enterprise institutions that have lots of data in terms of online graduation numbers and can therefore make that comparison much more readily. 38% said they use things like common exams and assignments within courses, so the kind of activities that students are engaged in. Some look at GPAs, but only a third, and whether it's GPAs overall or GPAs within comparable courses. There's the classic other category that we need to dig into in terms of open text responses. And then, interestingly, only 8% are in a position or take the time to actively compare post-graduation employment in a related field between their online graduates and their campus graduates. And as I said at the outset, I would argue that that metric on the right-hand side of the chart is a particularly important one for online learning, and in today's higher education climate where students, parents, regulators, and the media are obsessed with ROI, which tends to boil down to getting a job and getting a good job at a good wage. The sector as a whole, I think, is challenged to try and understand that kind of data and then connect it back to teaching and learning processes, controlling for all kinds of other variables. What's the institution's responsibility? What's the student's responsibility? What happens post-graduation? Should institutions be held liable for anything that happens after that point? All very interesting, difficult questions. But right now, I think online institutions are perhaps at the sharp end of that, or online programs are at the sharp end of that. And based on this data, the typical chief online officer does not have enough data on this crucial metric to come to a view as to the success of their online courses. They're very much relying on, perhaps inevitably, grades and retention and graduation rates, and that's great. But is that enough to really fulfill and demonstrate the success of online in this deeper, more long-term sense, rather than just in that more traditional academic sense? Next slide. Over to you, Ron.
Okay, I would have some comments on Richard's last two slides, but in the interest of time, we'll leave that to maybe the comments section. Here I'm going to talk a little bit about implementing quality assurance principles. Previous CLOE reports established the relative frequency with which different factors contributing to online program quality are being adopted. In the 2018 survey, we probed further on the sources of quality standards in each area. Here we see that in the majority of cases, standards for faculty development, student support services, and student outcomes are internally generated. That's the blue portion of the bar. While standards for course and program design are more likely influenced by external entities and accrediting bodies. It'll be interesting to see if this pattern is maintained if demands for external accountability increase in the coming years. But just to emphasize, it looks as if institutions are actively involved in all of these areas in setting their standards, but are most influenced by outside organizations in terms of course design and program design. We also asked who plays a role in reviewing based on quality standards in each area. Overwhelmingly, our respondents reported that institutional faculty and staff, primarily faculty, predominate in these processes. Aside from the review of online courses, the involvement of external reviews is not widespread. So you can see the 8% of shared reviews and 21% of externally conducted reviews for course design. That adds up to almost 30% in terms of an external component of quality review, but applies only at the course design level. The numbers drop off sharply after program design, and they're really quite marginal. And then are reforms mandated or voluntary? So when we asked about the implementation of review findings, we can see that the adoption of review recommendations is largely a matter of negotiation rather than mandate. The blue portion of the bar indicates where the review recommendations are mandated as changes and carried out. The red portion of the bar indicates where there's a mix of mandated and voluntary recommendations, and the green only voluntary ones. The pattern demonstrates that quality assurance reviews are only part of a complex institutional process that leads to change. And it behooves quality assurance advocates to recognize these realities, and that it is a matter of advocacy and negotiation to affect change over an extended period of time. We've reached the point where we'd like to save some time for your questions. We look forward to hearing your comments as well as questions, and I'm going to turn this over to Barbara to take us through the questions that have been accumulating.
Okay, there are a few questions at this time. The first one asks if either of you have an idea, either you or Richard, of what the future for multi-institutional consortia looks like.
Well, I guess, Richard, do you want to take it first?
Sure, I can give some thoughts on that. If we take a long-term perspective, I think there's always been this idea that does online encourage institutions to rethink scale, essentially, and are there valuable efficiencies in not every institution reinventing the wheel when it comes to design processes and all their own online courses and learning how best to teach them. And might there be some logic, particularly say in a public setting, in a state system, to rationalize all of that and to create some sort of state portal and shared courses and so on. And obviously over the years there's been various attempts to do that, but in my view, those efforts that perhaps were strongest 15, 20 years ago have to some extent played second fiddle to the stronger institutional instinct for bottom-up activity and local autonomy and all the logistical challenges of trying to coordinate across institutions. So I think there's a lot of rationality to consortia and all of that sharing and avoiding duplication of effort, but organizationally or culturally, I think it's difficult to pull off. So we have seen renewed interest, like say the Open SUNY move to try and take a lot of disparate online activity that's accumulated over the years across all the SUNY campuses and turn it into something more coordinated and powerful. We're seeing UMass Online with a new chief executive trying to do something creative and expansive there. We're seeing the California creation of a online community college, and you can cite all kinds of new initiatives, but I think they face all the same challenges that I just talked about. So I think it's going to be interesting to see whether the future looks any different from the past there.
Let me just add a few observations. One is pretty self-evident that online should be creating opportunities for sharing curricula that much more easily than on-ground programs can do it, because the students do not have to travel and move between institutions to take advantage of it. But there are those local characteristics of institutions that want to maintain their character, their autonomy, and so on. But this example is Richard cited, and one could add what's happening in Wisconsin and a number of other states, indicates that there is a resurgence of interest. And in terms of the ability of mid-level institutions to compete with some of the enterprise-level institutions for enrollment in the future, if they can smooth these relationships and make them really work well, they may be in a more competitive position. Barbara?
All right, the next question we've got: where do online instructors turn for help if their institution does not have a strong online committee or chief online officer for online instruction?
Well, I would say that they really need to find their advocates in the senior administration and the leadership, faculty leadership of the institution. There's no magic formula for doing this. If there isn't some grassroots support or a vision from the top of the institution, these things tend not to happen or to happen very slowly. But the creation of a chief online officer or an online learning council at an institution is more often the result rather than the cause of the momentum growth for online learning at that institution. It's a reflection of it rather than the initiating cause.
And I would just add that I think the key to overcoming those challenges is to try and frame the desire for online in a way that matters to the institution? What problems will online solve? How is it going to address big institutional goals? To what extent can you offset negative assumptions about online that may be limiting the thinking of leadership, if those assumptions are not based on evidence? So I think just trying to think big picture strategically rather than what I want to do with my course would be the way to do it.
Okay, we have someone asking for a comment on the distinction between an official Chief Online Officer and a de facto Chief Online Officer, and which is the likely assumption in the numbers reported earlier in the presentation.
Actually, in the cases that we have the most information about, I would describe the process of creating a Chief Online Officer as frequently the emergence of someone from the faculty or the support side of the administration as an advocate and as someone willing to undertake some of the difficult challenges of implementing and sustaining online programs. And over time, they accumulate more responsibility and more authority. And ultimately, this becomes recognized in terms of a formal title and report line. So I think that's a very common pattern over the last 10 years. But we're also seeing cases now where institutions simply decide we need to bring in someone who's going to take charge of this area and coordinate the disparate efforts that are occurring without enough force behind them. So we see both those patterns, and I think the second pattern is becoming more prevalent recently. And institutions that used to simply hire from within or promote from within on this are more and more turning to formal searches for experienced online leaders to take these roles. But it's a mix of both.
Right, and I would just add that obviously we're not saying the Chief Online Officer title is widely used. In fact, it's hardly ever used. We're more using that as a catch-all for the wide range of actual titles that individually signal, I think, the relative status and relative authority, relative development of such a role at an institution. So I think it'll be interesting over time to see whether the titles that the Chief Online Officer have start to signal greater seniority and authority, start to use words like chief something rather than associate VP or associate provost or whatever is perhaps more common now. So I think the distinction between the true Chief Online Officer, if we can use that term, and de facto is an important one, and it'll be interesting to see whether titles signal that move from one to the other more powerfully going forward, and I think they will.
We may have time for one more question.
Okay, let's see. Somebody did ask if it's possible to get contacts or names of other schools who have an online learning committee or council.
Well, I think the some of that information is in our data, but when we collect data through our survey, we promise anonymity to the institutions, to specific institutions. But if someone has a question about that and would like to follow up on governance structures, as we intend to do with the survey itself by talking to people involved, we may be able to broker that, but it would be on a case-by-case basis. I think we're just about out of time, and so I'd just like to ask the audience here, thank you for your time this afternoon. Urge you to look for the publication of our current survey, which will occur in the first quarter or so of 2019. And you'll see much more detailed coverage on the whole range of issues we listed at the beginning, as well as on the highlights that we've shared this afternoon. Also, for those of you who are Chief Online Officers or know who would deserve that designation at your institution, you may want to find out if they are currently involved in the survey, and if not, to have them get in touch with us or with either Richard or myself or Barbara Birch at Quality Matters and express interest in participating in the future. I think the value of the survey is going to be dependent on us building and maintaining a truly representative cross-section of institutions that are committed to online learning. And finally, I'd like to turn this back to Barbara to indicate what happens next in the Quality Matters Research webinar series.
Thanks everyone for attending today. There is going to be more information upcoming at qualitymatters.org/research about our continuing webinar series. I did see a couple of little questions in the webinar chat that we will follow up with via email. Thank you so much.